Welcome to the Claire and Horatio Daily World Brief, available at claireandhoratio.com. Today is Thursday, July 23, 2026. And we are looking at a massive stack of source material today, ranging from U.S. Central Command battle assessments to raw dispatches from the streets of New Delhi and Kyiv.
We are. Our goal is to take all these raw reports and really understand the underlying mechanisms connecting them, because you're watching a critical threshold being crossed in the Middle East right now.
Setting off a chain reaction that is rapidly altering global energy costs, European security, and the lives of millions of civilians caught in the crossfire. Just to establish the reality on the ground, we are now looking at a 13th consecutive night of U.S. military strikes against Iran.
Right. U.S. Central Command just concluded over 2 hours of bombardment. They were heavily targeting Iranian naval and drone facilities, specifically around the port city of Bandar Abbas and Qasem Island.
And UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres delivered a pretty stark warning to the Security Council, stating the region is teetering on the edge of the unimaginable.
While President Trump is openly floating what he terms a massive attack, and this is in response to recent Houthi militia strikes on Saudi oil tankers in the Red Sea.
He is simultaneously inflating the U.S. casualty figures from this conflict, claiming 18 American dead instead of the official Defense Department count of 14. He's drawing direct comparisons to the death toll of the Vietnam War to justify a heavier response.
But the human toll on the other side is no longer just collateral. It really seems baked into the strategy at this point.
Which brings me to the actual targets of these strikes. A U.S. strike just hit the Bonji desalination plant. Walk me through the mechanism here, because why target a water facility, and what is the immediate consequence for civilians on the ground?
Well, targeting dual-use infrastructure like a desalination plant is designed to degrade state capacity. That Bonji facility uses reverse osmosis to turn seawater into potable water for the surrounding coastal region.
So by destroying it, you instantly leave 20 villages entirely without drinking water in 40 degrees Celsius heat.
Yes. Residents are reporting sheer panic over heat exhaustion. The situation is being described as a living hell of power cuts and internet shutdowns.
And the Iranian regime is actually using the chaos of this external war as a smokescreen for internal crackdowns.
They're utilizing the conflict as cover for severe internal repression. I mean, human rights organizations report the government has executed over 400 people this year alone.
They are essentially clearing out political prisoners and executing protesters, using the justification of a wartime environment to swiftly stifle domestic dissent without international scrutiny.
And that military and human crisis translates directly into household impact globally.
Because Brent crude oil has spiked to over $100 a barrel following the collapse of the earlier ceasefire and the Houthi threats to shipping lanes. If you are wondering how a strike in Bandar Abbas affects you, it directly raises petrol prices at the pump,
which reignites broad inflation fears across the entire global economy,
forcing U.S. Federal Reserve Chair Kevin Warsh to hold interest rates steady at 3.5 to 3.75%, despite intense political pressure from the White House demanding borrowing cost reductions. If we look at this Middle East conflict as a global pressure cooker, the primary diplomatic valve has basically been welded shut.
So the steam is blasting out of the weakest points it can find, hitting local water supplies in southern Iran and grocery budgets globally.
But I am looking at reports out of Berlin, and I need you to explain this link. How does this spillover specifically threaten domestic European security?
It sounds like a geographical leap, but the mechanism is direct retaliation. Iran's ultra-conservative Hamshari newspaper recently published a hit list featuring German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, depicted in an orange prison uniform,
threatening retaliation for Merz's logistical and diplomatic support of the U.S. and Israeli military campaign that killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei earlier this year. Are European intelligence agencies taking a newspaper graphic seriously?
German intelligence agencies are treating this as an active, high-level threat. They are currently tracking approximately 180 individuals linked to the Iranian Revolutionary Guards and intelligence services within Germany.
The specific fear being that Tehran might activate what security experts call disposable agents.
Exactly. These are individuals, often recruited from criminal networks rather than trained spies, who are paid to carry out a single high-profile attack in Europe.
providing Iran with plausible deniability while extending their lethal reach far beyond the Middle East. You see that same blunt force unilateral approach defining Washington's military actions bleeding right into how the U.S. is treating its closest neighbors economically.
Because the Trump administration is completely bypassing a recent Supreme Court ruling to impose sweeping new tariffs.
Acting U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer has levied duties ranging from 10 to 12.5% on 60 trading partners. This covers 99.4% of all U.S. imports, and it is being done under the banner of combating forced labor.
But the most aggressive move is against Canada, which is now facing a targeted punitive 50% tariff aimed specifically at crushing its dairy supply management system.
What exactly is that system, and why is the U.S. trying to destroy it?
Canada's dairy supply management system is essentially a government-enforced cartel designed to protect domestic farmers. Instead of letting the free market dictate milk prices, the Canadian government sets strict production quotas.
Meaning a farmer is only allowed to produce a specific amount of milk, which prevents oversupply and guarantees the farmer a stable, high price.
And to prevent cheaper foreign milk from undercutting this system, Canada imposes massive tariffs on dairy imports. It is politically sacrosanct in Canada because it keeps rural farmers profitable.
But Washington views it as deeply unfair protectionism. The U.S. strategy here is to apply overwhelming economic pain, a 50% tariff on other vital Canadian goods, to force Ottawa to dismantle that quota system and absorb surplus American milk.
The administration is extending this unilateral approach to immigration and refugee policy as well.
The State Department is expanding its refugee cap for the 2026 fiscal year by 10,000 spots, but they are reserving those additional spaces exclusively for white South Africans.
The stated justification is an alleged and completely unproven genocide against white farmers in the country.
To underscore how selective this is, Washington is simultaneously suspending refugee intake from the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Sudan, where active, documented mass atrocities are occurring. This isn't just about domestic politics. This is diplomatic retaliation against South Africa.
It's a highly calculated diplomatic punishment. Washington is reacting to two major moves by Pretoria. First, South Africa brought genocide charges against Israel at the International Court of Justice, which infuriated the White House.
And second, South Africa is playing a pivotal role in the BRICS nations' ongoing de-dollarization efforts. Explain the mechanism of that de-dollarization. How are they actually doing it?
Well, historically, if Brazil wanted to trade with South Africa, they would convert their local currencies into U.S. dollars to settle the transaction through Western-dominated financial messaging systems like SWIFT.
De-dollarization means these countries are building alternative financial architecture to trade directly in their own local currencies, the rand, the real, the yuan.
By doing this, they bypass the U.S. financial system entirely, which weakens Washington's ability to use the dollar as a tool for sanctions.
So reserving refugee spots based on race while ignoring active war zones is Washington's way of signaling absolute hostility toward South Africa's government for challenging U.S. financial and diplomatic hegemony. We see another major diplomatic condition laid out by the White House involving Saudi Arabia.
A multi-billion-dollar civilian nuclear deal is being held hostage.
President Trump has stated this deal, which would provide massive access for American companies to build Saudi nuclear infrastructure, is entirely contingent on Riyadh joining the Abraham Accords and formally recognizing the State of Israel.
That is a condition Saudi Arabia has historically resisted without the establishment of a Palestinian state.
Let me push back on this entire doctrine. If every single diplomatic and economic relationship is reduced to a blunt force ultimatum, from Canadian milk tariffs to selective refugee quotas to withholding nuclear technology, doesn't that inherently isolate the U.S. from the very global framework it built?
Reducing statecraft to ultimatums definitely risks replacing enduring alliances with transactional compliance. And before we examine the long-term consequences of that strategy, for more daily briefings, brain candy explainers, and classic audiobooks, visit clarinarratio.com. To answer your question, when trade partners and allies are forced to operate under constant threat of tariffs or diplomatic retaliation, they inevitably begin seeking those alternative networks we just discussed.
We're seeing countries actively look for ways to reduce their dependence on the U.S. market and the U.S. dollar, which ultimately diminishes Washington's long-term structural influence.
That concept of unchecked state power in Washington connects directly to the unchecked power of the technology sector, which is increasingly operating beyond the reach of traditional governments.
Specifically in the realms of space and artificial intelligence. Elon Musk provided a highly revealing interview with The Economist this week, where he admitted he got carried away with his political involvement.
Referring to his brief role running the Department of Government Efficiency, where he oversaw $150 billion in budget cuts and forced out tens of thousands of federal workers.
He stated he likely wouldn't do it again, preferring to focus his immense capital and power on AI and space exploration.
That pivot to space brings us to a critical environmental threshold that is flying entirely under the radar. SpaceX and Blue Origin are proposing putting millions of what they call orbital data centers into space.
The logic being that terrestrial data centers consume too much energy and water for cooling, and they face massive regulatory hurdles on Earth.
So by putting servers in orbit, they can harvest solar power continuously and use the vacuum of space for free cooling.
That sounds like an elegant engineering solution until you look at the physical science of how things come back down. Former National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration officials are warning this poses a severe existential threat to the planet's atmosphere.
The core problem is the life cycle of these satellites. Low Earth orbit satellites have a short lifespan.
When millions of these servers and rockets eventually deorbit and burn up upon re-entry, they release black soot, rare metals, and massive amounts of aluminum oxides into the stratosphere.
And aluminum oxide acts as a catalyst for chemical reactions that destroy ozone. By solving their energy and regulatory problems on Earth, these companies risk chemically altering the Earth's atmosphere and depleting the ozone layer.
Furthermore, the Federal Communications Commission applications submitted by these tech companies contain zero meaningful environmental mitigation plans. It is essentially sweeping your trash under the rug, except the rug is the stratosphere and the trash is toxic aluminum.
And while they look to space, the terrestrial tech battle is accelerating, and the U.S. approach is starting to show serious cracks.
The U.S. has focused heavily on closed, ultra-expensive AI systems, relying on brute force computing power, but China is rapidly closing the technology gap using open-source models.
The Chinese startup Moonshot AI just released its Kimi K3 model. It matches top U.S. models like Anthropic's Claude on key reasoning benchmarks, but it does so using far less computing power and at a fraction of the cost.
How does an open-source model actually achieve that without the multi-billion-dollar hardware advantage?
It basically comes down to algorithmic efficiency rather than sheer scale. U.S. companies have historically trained massive models with trillions of parameters, which requires enormous, power-hungry data center clusters.
While open-source communities and Chinese startups like Moonshot AI have focused on refining the architecture of the models, filtering training data more aggressively, and optimizing how the model processes information.
They are proving that you don't necessarily need endless physical infrastructure if your underlying code is highly efficient.
The U.S. response to this competitive threat has been to issue threats of sanctions and bans over alleged intellectual property theft, rather than competing on efficiency. The contradiction here is staggering.
In what way?
The orbital data center rush resembles a 19th century gold rush, but this time, the miners are altering the chemical composition of the sky we all share. If the U.S. government is threatening to ban Chinese AI models to protect national security, how can they simultaneously allow domestic tech billionaires to unilaterally pollute the global stratosphere without any international oversight?
It exposes a massive blind spot in global governance. Governments are highly attuned to traditional nation-state threats, which is why Washington is hyper-focused on the U.S.-China AI rivalry.
However, regulatory institutions are completely ill-equipped to manage the planetary-scale ambitions of their own domestic tech elites.
The frameworks of agencies like the SEC were built for a localized telecommunications era involving radio towers and television broadcasts. They were never designed to oversee private corporations attempting to industrialize the Earth's orbit.
That feeling of powerlessness, whether against distant geopolitical wars, blunt force economic tariffs, or untouchable tech billionaires, altering the atmosphere links directly to a massive civic backlash happening on the ground in two major democracies today.
In India, a profound youth protest movement is sweeping the country. It was sparked initially by a Supreme Court justice who derisively called unemployed youth cockroaches during a hearing.
Instead of backing down, the students embraced the insult, forming a movement they named the Cockroach Janta Party. But the insult was just the match. The actual fuel for this fire is systemic corruption in the educational system.
Specifically, massive university exam paper leaks The exam leaks exposed a system where merit means nothing if you have the money to buy the answers in advance.
Tens of thousands of young people have marched on Parliament in New Delhi, resulting in severe tear gas and baton charges from police. The civic stakes here are existential for the state.
This isn't an ideological, religious, or caste-based dispute, which are common in Indian politics. It is a fundamental breakdown of trust in the state's ability to govern fairly.
Prime Minister Narendra Modi's government relies on the promise of economic development, but when the basic mechanism of social mobility, a fair university exam, is hopelessly corrupted, millions of young Indians realize the system is entirely rigged against them.
And we are seeing a different version of that same frustration in Kyiv, where wartime unity is visibly fracturing.
Rare street protests have broken out over President Volodymyr Zelensky's recent government shakeup. Reform-minded Defense Minister Mikhailo Fedorov, who was widely credited with boosting Ukraine's drone warfare capabilities, has been abruptly ousted.
Fedorov clashed heavily with military chief Oleksandr Syrsky over battlefield strategy and entrenched bureaucracy.
In his place, lawmakers have just approved the chief of the state energy company Naftogaz, Sergei Koretsky, as the new prime minister, signaling that the government is prioritizing energy sector survival ahead of a brutal winter.
This domestic turmoil inside Ukraine coincides with a major transition in the UK, as outgoing Prime Minister Keir Starmer and incoming Prime Minister Andy Burnham jointly pledge about $345 million to secure Swedish Gripen fighter jets for Ukraine.
But looking at the protests in Kyiv alongside the unrest in New Delhi, a clear pattern emerges. Whether it's young people in India demanding a transparent test, or citizens in Ukraine demanding competent, reform-minded military leadership, populations are refusing to accept the excuse of wartime patriotism to cover up institutional incompetence.
Are we witnessing the limit of how much citizens are willing to sacrifice for the state?
We are seeing a stark reminder of a government's primary mandate. The basic social contract between a citizen and the state relies on fairness, security, and competence.
When state institutions fail at those foundational tasks, whether it's securing a medical exam paper from being sold on the black market or managing a defense ministry transparently during an invasion, no amount of grand geopolitical narrative can prevent civil unrest.
Citizens will only endure sacrifice for a system they believe is fundamentally functioning in their collective interest. When that belief evaporates, the authority of the state fractures. I want to leave you with this stark contrast to mull over today.
We are living in an era where humanity possesses the technology to build autonomous reasoning engines that fit on a microchip, and private companies possess the capital to launch millions of data centers into the vacuum of space.
Yet our foundational institutions are struggling to administer a fair university exam, or maintain basic trade relations without extortion, or keep drinking water flowing to villages during a conflict. The gap between our technological capability and our basic human governance has never been wider. Thank you for listening. For more Daily World briefs and classic audiobooks, please visit clarinhoratio.com.